Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture. So last time we got more into the Civil War and actually what Black people did during the Civil War, right? So many of them initially ran away to Union camps as contraband and basically were still technically enslaved, but they weren't working for their Southern masters. Now, when the Emancipation Proclamation came out, which we talked about mainly freed non-Union occupied territories, so mainly the Confederate held territories. Many of these slaves got to were not only basically free now, but they got to fight in the military, right? So they joined the Union Army. Some of them got to fight in important battles, like the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which we're kind of going to come back to today as well. There were black doctors, etc., although the majority of them could not be promoted to higher positions in the military, but some of them got paid the same as white soldiers and seamen, so it was cool, right? We also, we just basically finished talking about that stuff, right? We talked about the Battle of Gettysburg and how that was an important turning point in the war, not only for battle-wise, right, but also Lincoln uses his opportunity to refocus the purpose of the war onto getting rid of slavery. So today we're going to finish our 11th PowerPoint by talking about actually a survivor of the 54th, right? I basically said before that the majority of the 54th perished in that particular battle, but there were some survivors, including this man. And then we're going to begin our final PowerPoint by talking about what happened after the war. Okay. So the man pictured here is William H. Carney. So let's talk about his story. Okay. So William H. Carney, the H stands for Harvey, was born a slave in Norfolk, Virginia in 1840. His father, William Sr., had escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad and eventually earned enough money to buy the freedom of his wife and son. William Carney Jr., right, after he was freed, him and his family moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Carney had intended to pursue ecclesiastical training with the intentions of becoming a minister. So basically, he wanted to work in the church for the rest of his life. Instead of following the call to preach, he decided to enlist in the Union Army in 1863, following the Emancipation Proclamation, which for the first time in the Civil War officially authorized the recruitment of black soldiers. Recruited out of New Bedford, Carney joined the soon-to-be famous all-black 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, commanded by 26-year-old Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the son of a wealthy Boston abolitionist. If you watch the movie Glory, which I mentioned last time, Shaw is played by Matthew Broderick, who's famous for his role as Ferris Bueller. Carney soon rose to the rank of sergeant due to his education and strong potential to lead others. During the summer of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts was sent to James Island, South Carolina, where the unit saw its first combat. After 2 days of sleep and food deprivation, the 54th Regiment was ordered into battle. Shaw volunteered the 54th to lead the charge on the heavily garrisoned and fortified Fort Wagner, which we talked about, right? The majority of them died. During the battle, Shaw was pinned down beneath the parapet of the fort and was desperately trying to rally his men forward. As Shaw and the flag bearer were mortally wounded and began to fall, Carney seized the colors, aka the flag, and prevented the flag from touching the ground. He struggled up the parapet and, though wounded in the legs, chest, and arm, planted the colors at the top of the parapet. Despite his wounds and the heavy gunfire around him, Carney was able to keep the flag aloft, meaning standing up straight and waving in the wind. Right. Carney and the rest of the 54th Massachusetts remained pinned down. Only after reinforcements arrived was the beleaguered and decimated unit able to withdraw. Struggling back to Union lines while carrying the colors, Carney collapsed, saying, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." After the battle, Carney was discharged from the infantry due to his wounds. For his act of heroism at Fort Wagner, Carney was awarded the highest military honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, which we still award to those who exemplify bravery in the battlefield even today. Carney was the first African American to receive this award, and you can see that it's pinned on his jacket, which if I got an award like that, I'd definitely pin it on my jacket. Upon his death in 1908, the flag at the Massachusetts State House was flown half-mast in his remembrance, an honor usually given only to a deceased governor, senator, congressman, or U.S. president. So Carney's super important. There's actually an order of William H. Carney, people who remember him, and an organization that chooses to honor military veterans and good acts of service through his name. So he's a guy that not a lot of people learn about, but he's super important, right? Especially to a lot of people. If you take a look at, for A, it's not a video per se, it's a link to a video on Facebook through one of these Carney organizations, and they provide more info on who Carney was. And again, it's important to talk about individuals when you talk about history, right? It humanizes history. It shows you who was there at that point, right? Instead of just overarching views of history, we can actually connect to the individual person that lived in that point in time. And here are his medals. Actually, I think it's the same medal, just flipped around. This is the Congressional Medal of Honor back in the day. Now, usually you get the award this medal if, again, you were put in a very dangerous situation and you made it out and you exemplified patriotism, bravery, all that stuff, which Carney did by protecting the flag, right? Nowadays, there are people who are wounded in battle, or you can be given the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously, which means after you die. So your family can be awarded the medal if you died in bravery on behalf of your fellow soldiers. So that's it for PowerPoint 11. Okay, that's it for the Civil War. Now we're going to start the final PowerPoint, okay, and this is titled Reconstruction. Right? So in this PowerPoint, to finish off our class, right, this goes from 1865 around the end of the war to 1877. So for these 12 years, we're going to discuss how the government tried to assimilate Black people into American society, basically, right? Because we've had a couple hundred years of slavery. A lot of people have never known a life of freedom or citizenship or whatever, right? Free or enslaved. So it's up to the government to make sure that freed men, women, and children can learn how to be successful in America. Okay, and that's why it's called Reconstruction. Normally in my high schools, as a side note, I have my students sort of discuss if they were the government, what would they do with Reconstruction? And they have all sorts of ideas, but they realize it's very complicated, right? So this is a depiction of Ulysses S. Grant and General Robert E. Lee, both were generals, by the way, and signing basically the surrender, right? The South is saying the war's over, we surrender, we want to come back to the Union. So that's the end of the war. Seems very anticlimactic, especially if you're a soldier on either side who lost a limb or your family or your whole fortune, and you're like, that's it, right? So here's a depiction of emancipation, right? You can see the trials and tribulations of slavery surrounding the central image of this Black family, right? All together, happy, in a comfy home, right? Living like regular people, basically. And that was the idea of emancipation, the opportunity to be your own person. And this is a picture of the Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll talk about. This is the government body that was responsible for these freed men, women, and children, basically protecting them from agitated white people who are angry that's not only is slavery over, but Black people are getting more rights. And basically that's a pretty good summary of what the Reconstruction period was. Now, we talked about before, right, in 1865, not only did the war end, but also President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the secessionists. So who took over? Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president for only a few weeks before Lincoln was assassinated, and so he was required to step up to the plate, right? So traditionally, if the president dies, the vice president takes over. But if the president and the vice president die, then the Speaker of the House takes over. Currently, that's Nancy Pelosi, of the Democratic Party. Yay, here's another picture of him. Kind of reminds me of Stephen Douglas a little bit, just like that same like kind of frowny face with short dark hair, you know, like, and always wearing a dark suit. Right? They remind me of each other. Andrew Johnson was born on December 29th, 1808, but died on July 31st, 1875, and was the 17th President of the United States, serving from 1865 to 1869. So he only served for one, maybe a little bit more into his second term. Johnson assumed the presidency as he was Vice President of the United States at the time of the assassination. Right? A Democrat who ran with Lincoln on the National Union ticket, Johnson came to office as the Civil War concluded. He favored quick restoration of the seceded states to the Union, so he didn't want to punish the South. He wanted them immediately to come back into the fray. His plans did not give protection to the former slaves. He came into conflict with the Republican-dominated Congress, who culminating in his impeachment by the House of Representatives. He was acquitted in the Senate by one vote. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second when I go into more detail about the impeachment. Johnson's main accomplishment as president is the Alaska Purchase. So he purchased Alaska from Russia. Okay, but Alaska officially didn't become a state until the 1950s. Johnson was born in poverty in Raleigh, North Carolina, and never attended school. Apprenticed as a tailor, he worked in several frontier towns before settling in Greenville, Tennessee. So frontier town is basically a town that's built up all of a sudden because there's all this land that nobody's occupied before. Okay, cowboys were in a lot of frontier towns. He served as a mayor before being elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in 1835. After brief service in the Tennessee Senate, Johnson was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1843, where he served 5 two-year terms. He became governor of Tennessee for 4 years and was elected by the legislature to the U.S. Senate in 1857. In his congressional service, he sought passage of the Homestead Bill, which was enacted soon after he left his Senate seat in 1862. As Southern slave states, including Tennessee, seceded to form the Confederate States of America, Johnson remained firmly within the Union. So basically, as all of his colleagues around him went to the Confederate side, he said nah. Right. He was the only sitting senator from a Confederate state who did not resign his seat upon learning of his state's secession. In 1862, Lincoln appointed him as military governor of Tennessee after most of it had been retaken. In 1864, Johnson, who was a war Democrat and Southern Unionist, meaning that he loved war, but he wanted the South to come back, was a logical choice as a running mate for Lincoln, who wished to send a message of national unity in his re-election campaign, and their ticket easily won. So basically, strategically, Lincoln saw this guy, and he's like, well, he's stuck to the Union side, kind of, and he represents the South, so it's a good idea for him to be my new vice president. It shows the South that we're willing to come back together. When Johnson was sworn in as vice president in March 1865, he gave a rambling speech, after which he secluded himself to avoid public ridicule. So basically, he gave a speech that was too long, everybody made fun of him, and then he locked himself in his room. 6 weeks later, the assassination of Lincoln made him president. So he was only a vice president for like a month and a half. Right? That's crazy. That's like if you were like the secretary for a CEO, suddenly CEO dies or leaves, and they're like, okay, you're the CEO now. You're like, what the hell? I'm not qualified for this. Johnson implemented his own form of presidential reconstruction, a series of proclamations directing the seceded states to hold conventions and elections to reform their civil governments. This is an issue, okay, just as a side note, because we just got out of a war with the South, who was not afraid to leave and fought us, right? And said, we're not in the United States anymore. We're going to do our own thing. Fuck the US, right? And Johnson's like, well, we should give them their power back. As a comparison, right? Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party leaders were absolutely not allowed to retake some of their former positions, right? Yet Johnson wanted to do this with the South, which is crazy. When Southern states returned many of their old leaders and passed black codes, which we'll talk about in this PowerPoint, to deprive the freedmen of many civil liberties, congressional Republicans refused to seat legislatures from those states and advanced the legislation to overrule the Southern actions. So the Republicans were trying to keep the South in check. They're like, no, we just got out of war with you. You don't get to do what you want. You need to pay for what you did. Okay. Johnson vetoed all their bills, right? The president has the power to throw out a bill potentially if he doesn't agree with it. And congressional Republicans overrode him, setting a pattern for the remainder of his presidency. So basically, what they did is the Republicans held the House of Representatives, which is the first stop for a bill, and the Senate, which is the second stop. So if a bill passes both of those, it goes to the president's desk, right? Now, the president can choose to sign it or veto it. If the president vetoes the bill, it goes back to Congress, and if Congress passes it with a 2/3 majority, it still passes, which they did because the Republicans had most of the seats, right? Because most of the Democrats were from the South, and they couldn't come back to the government yet. So they basically played tug of war for a while. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to former slaves, which we'll talk about as well. In 1866, Johnson went on an unprecedented national tour promoting his executive policies, seeking to destroy his Republican opponents. As the conflict between the branches of government grew, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, restricting Johnson's ability to fire cabinet officials. So, kind of like the current president, he has fired quite a bit of people since he's been elected. Johnson was continuing to do that, and for the sake of stability, the Republicans are like, no, you can't just fire whoever you want. Okay. Here's a political cartoon of honest Uncle Sam, right, who's supposed to represent the U.S., sort of looking down on Johnson. When Johnson persisted in trying to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he was impeached by the House of Representatives and narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate and removal from office. Okay. So here's how impeachment works, right? For those of you who didn't really get it, okay? Impeachment basically goes as follows. So Congress has to put forth the articles of impeachment, which basically is their document saying that we want to kick the president out because he did this, this, and this. Right. For Johnson, the consensus for his impeachment is that he was not only on the side of the South, who was very treasonous, right, who tried to leave the Union, all that stuff, but also he was actively trying to prevent Congress from doing their job, right, and firing cabinet officials when in a time of instability, which he shouldn't be doing. Okay. Then the House of Representatives votes, and if they have a majority vote, then you are technically impeached, okay, meaning that they all declared that you should not be the president. Then it goes to the Senate, okay. Now the Senate needs to vote on whether they agree. If the Senate says yes and votes, you are officially impeached and you're kicked out of the government immediately, okay. We've never had the Senate vote to impeach somebody because either they left, like Richard Nixon, or the Senate decided not to. Okay, so that was the case for Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton in the 90s with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right, where he had an affair with his intern, and the current president, President Trump, for his calls and blackmailing of the Ukraine for information on Joe Biden and his son. Okay. So, again, Nixon left before they could do it, or they might have impeached him. Okay. So Johnson was impeached, right? After failing to win the 1868 Democratic presidential nomination, because why would you not elect somebody who just got impeached? Johnson left office in 1869. Returning to Tennessee after his presidency, Johnson sought political vindication and gained it in his eyes when he was elected to the Senate again in 1875, making Johnson the only former president to serve in the Senate. Right? We've had a president, William Howard Taft, who served on the Supreme Court, but normally presidents don't go back into government, right? They sort of retire. He died months into his term. Johnson's strong opposition to federally guaranteed rights for African Americans is widely criticized. He is regarded by many historians as one of the worst presidents in American history. Okay. So, yeah, up with people like Hoover, Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression, James K. Polk and Zachary Taylor that were present around the Mexican-American War. You know, there's a list. So if you take a look at video B, there's more information on Johnson and his impeachment. And here he is stepping out of a train car, speaking to the crowd. So it's bad. It's a bad look for the country if a president's impeached. That's why Congress doesn't like to do it, because it shows that, you know, not only do we elect someone that, you know, lies or cheats or whatever, or interferes with our government, but also it makes our government look bad, like we don't have our shit together. So our next topic is reparations. Okay, you may have heard this term before, but if you haven't, basically reparations are some sort of payment or compensation to a group that was oppressed, right? For example, we gave the Japanese Americans reparations after imprisoning them in concentration camps or internment camps, you like to say, right, during World War II. Also, some Jewish people got reparations after the Holocaust, right? Black people have never received reparations in the history of this country. So that's what we're going to talk about, because they did initially have a plan for reparations, although it fell through. If you take a look at video C, there's more info on Special Order number 15, and I'll also point to a couple funny videos for you guys. So Special Field Order 15 was a military order issued during the American Civil War on January 16, 1865. So we're going back a few months before Johnson. By General William Tecumseh Sherman, who is pictured here, commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi of the United States Army. Sherman is famous for leading a march throughout the South where he burned and pillaged Southern homes. And what's good about that in war is that you're getting rid of the opposing side's supplies, okay, and that forced the South to surrender a lot sooner than they could have. They provided for the confiscation of 400,000 acres of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and the dividing of it into parcels of not more than 40 acres, on which were to be settled approximately 18,000 formerly enslaved families and other blacks then living in the area. The orders were issued following Sherman's march to the sea. They were intended to address the immediate problem of dealing with the tens of thousands of black refugees who had joined Sherman's march in search of protection and sustenance, and to assure the harmony of action in the area of operations. So basically, what this was Sherman did his march, right? He took over all this land in the South that he burned and whatever, and so they had all these black people, former slaves, whatever, following him, and they were like, well, where should we put them? So they had the idea that they would parcel out this land into 40 acres per black family um, as a form of reparations, right? They get 40 acres and a mule. Now, if you're from the black community, maybe you've heard this term before, 40 acres and a mule, but this is pretty synonymous with reparations because this is our first indication of possible reparations. His intention was for the order to be a temporary measure to address an immediate problem and not to grant permanent ownership of the land to the freedmen, although most of the recipients assumed otherwise. The orders had little concrete effect, and President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation that returned the lands to Southern owners that took a loyalty oath. So basically, they went back to their original owners, and that's maybe partly why we impeached Johnson. General Saxton and his staff at the Charleston, South Carolina Freedmen's Bureau office refused to carry out President Johnson's wishes and denied all applications to have lands returned. In the end, Johnson and his allies removed General Saxton, but not before Congress is able to provide legislation to assist some families in keeping their lands. Although mules are not mentioned in the order, they were the main source of the expression 40 acres and a mule. Okay. So, recently, Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker proposed a bill that would pay about $100 billion in reparations over 10 years to the black community. When I talk to my students about this, it sounds good in theory, but in practice it's difficult, right? Because reparations can count for a lot of things, right? For both slavery and for the systematic abuse and oppression of black people ever since then, right? Because the oppression kept going. Right? If you take History 30B, you'll learn about that as well. But also, who do you determine gets reparations and how much, right? Because we're very mixed race now. So can a mixed race person get reparations, or do you have to be 100% black? Which really most African Americans are not, right? Because of what we talked about with slave women being taken advantage of, right? So there's always some mix of non-black in that equation. But it's difficult, so it will be interesting to see, one, if that bill ever gets passed, and two, who gets what. Okay. And there's a lot of people who disagree with reparations. Not only the people who think that black people don't deserve shit, which I disagree, but also the people who believe that reparations won't solve the inequalities that black people face, and that, you know, they're not the best step. Okay, so there's still arguments and debates about it. So Dave Chappelle did a funny episode about reparations if you want to check that out. Just like Google Dave Chappelle reparations. I usually show it in class. We all have a good laugh. All right. So our next and I guess final topic for today is about the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau, as I briefly mentioned today, was the government organization created specifically to help black men, women, and children, right? This is a picture of a northern teacher, and she's teaching all different ages because by the end of the Civil War, around 7% of the black community was literate. Okay, so we had to get those numbers up because the government's trying to get black people to start voting, and you can't really vote if you can't read or write. Okay, so here's Freedmen's Bureau. I think this is one of their offices helping people sign up for IDs, maybe teaching them, stuff like that. So the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, usually referred to simply as the Freedmen's Bureau, was an agency of the United States Department of War to direct such issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel as may deem needful for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which established the Freedmen's Bureau on March 3, 1865, was initiated by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln and was intended to last for 1 year after the end of the Civil War. So this was only meant to be temporary, basically, although it would go on a lot longer. If you take a look at video D, there is more info on the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau was made a part of the United States Department of War as it was the only agency with an existing organization that could be assigned to the South. Headed by Union Army General Oliver O. Howard, the Bureau started operations in 1865. Throughout the first year, its representatives learned that these tasks would be very difficult, as Southern legislatures passed laws for black codes that restricted movement, conditions of labor, and other rights of African Americans, nearly duplicating conditions of slavery. So we'll talk about later how the black codes were these really oppressive rules that basically tried to keep black people subservient to white people, right, or punish them for minor crimes. The Bureau's powers were expanded to help African Americans find family members from whom they had been separated during the war. And what's sad is not everybody got to find their family again. It arranged to teach them to read and write, considered critical by the freedmen themselves as well as the government, again for voting. Bureau agents also served as legal advocates for African Americans in both local and national courts, mostly in cases dealing with family issues. So you got lawyers this time, right? They can actually argue for themselves in court now. The Bureau encouraged former major planters to rebuild their plantations and urged freed blacks to return to work for them, keep an eye on contracts between the newly freed laborers and planters, and pushed whites and blacks to work together in a free labor market as employers and employees rather than masters and slaves. So not only are they helping black people assimilate, but also they're trying to encourage equality between white people and black people. In 1866, Congress renewed the charter for the Bureau, meaning that they agreed to keep it going. President Johnson vetoed the bill because he believed that it encroached on states' rights, relied inappropriately on the military in peacetime, and would prevent freed slaves from becoming independent by offering too much assistance. So, okay, let's focus on this. Relied on the military. So, after the Civil War, the government kept the Union soldiers in the South to not only help in reconstructing the South that was mainly destroyed from the war, but also to make sure that the South wasn't re-enslaving the black people. So those soldiers would stay there until 1877. Also, this idea that they would rely on the government because they're not slaves anymore, so they assume that they would be lazy now, they wouldn't want to work, stuff like that, is a stereotype that still is used against the black community today, right? That black people depend on the government too much, right? Which is simply not true, but So, by 1869, the Bureau had lost most of its funding at the hands of Southern Democrats, and as a result was forced to cut much of its staff. By 1870, the Bureau had been weakened further due to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan against the South, whose members attacked both blacks and sympathetic white Republicans, including teachers. We will talk about the KKK as well. Northern Democrats were against the program, paying it as a program that would make African Americans lazy, which we just talked about, right? And in 1872, Congress abruptly abandoned the program, refusing to approve a renewal authorizing legislation. So basically, they only lasted for 7 years when they were supposed to last one, which was good, right? It was helped along too a little bit by Ulysses S. Grant, who I believe was president after Johnson, but ultimately people didn't really want to pay for these type of programs, so it eventually died. Here is a very racist newspaper about sort of against the Freedmen's Bureau, right? So it says Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president, and made a law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the president and you protect the white man. So this is during, we can assume, Johnson's tenure as president. And basically this is a depiction of a lazy black person lounging around while a white person works. Now again, the irony is completely lost on them since black people worked for free for over 200 years beforehand. So, And here's a marriage certificate. Now, this is one of the most important things that came from Reconstruction as well, right? That Black people got to get married legally for the first time, not only recognizing them as legal spouses, but also legal individuals. So it was a super important document. Although they still did the jumping the broom ceremony just for tradition's sake. So that's it for today. So next time we're going to take a look at some more Reconstruction programs, including one that actually backfired and kept Black people poor for many years. We'll talk about the Black Codes, which I mentioned today, and those horrible rules. We'll talk about what the Republicans did during this time, and also the amendment that finally made Black people into citizens.